Theatre of War, the Pacific. Tensions rise, the opening moves. Written and narrated by Liam Dale. While humanity and our place in the world has changed over the generations, there's one part of our nature that has remained present. War, and the reasons for it, seem to reoccur unabated throughout our history, and it's only when looking back on the myriad of battles that you can see the patterns. These parallels can likewise be drawn when looking into the events of World War II, and the build-up of distrust between not only the Axis and Allied sides of the conflict, but also between the countries found on either side of the metaphorical line in the sand. In this program, we'll be investigating the build-up to the outbreak of the Second World War and looking into what led to the alliance of Japan's Empire of the Rising Sun with Hitler's Nazi Germany. With the backdrop of growing tension between the world's many superpowers, we'll break down not only the immediate precursors to the war, but also the deep-seated distrust and historical prejudices that brought it about. Though before we get to dealing with the 20th century's part in this theatrical build-up of aggression, we must first take into account what brought the nations to this point and how the many generations of humans that came before helped shape the climate that made the epic clash of so many countries possible. It's easy to look back at the past, study the history of war, and uncover dramatic reports of heroic exploits, daring deeds, evil megalomaniacs and vicious dictators, and all too soon you'll find yourself completely detached from such events. The turbulent wars that took place so long ago seem to have little connection with reality and will, in point of fact, often be the stuff of legend. Whether you consider the conflicts of the ancient Greeks, the battles for Troy, or Alexander the Great's conquest for world domination, what we now know often owes more to movie makers of the more recent past's interpretations. War is about heroes, glory, and a rip-roaring story, and invariably the true horrors of human conflict are lost in the telling. What's more, the old adage that history is only ever written by the victors is extremely accurate, or it was, until the wider use of photography, developed through the course of the 20th century, painted a very different picture indeed. So to really understand the concept of war on a global scale, the World War II years of 1939 to 45 provide perhaps the first complete overview of man's inhumanity to man, alongside the bravery and heroism that show the very worst and the very best facets of human nature. Incredibly, there are archive images from every stage of this conflict, and as we consider the events of the Second World War chronologically, this series of programs will build into the ultimate timeline. This is our past that we can truly connect with, revealing a history littered with living, breathing survivors who can still tell stories of the comradeship, hardship, suffering, and sadly, on occasion, the futility of battle. However, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. To truly understand the events of the Second World War and its build-up, we need to look into some of the major events that led to its breakout. Perhaps the most influential, beyond all others, was the outcome and aftermath of the First World War. This conflict was a key point in not only Hitler's rise to power, but the rearmament of Germany and the beginning of tensions in the East. The First World War, spanning the years of 1914 to 1918, is often referred to as the Great War, although there was little that was great about it. It was also called the War to End All Wars, which is rather a tragic misnomer with the benefit of hindsight. The figures for the casualties are staggering, with approximately 40 million people suffering injury on a very personal level, and at least half of these casualties proved to be fatal. This so-called Great War ended with an armistice at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, after which the defeated German Empire had its own internal revolution, leading to the end of the monarchy and the setting up of Germany as a republic. Even after the armistice was signed, the victorious forces still kept up their blockades around the country. This led to imports and exports being severely reduced, which did little to help Germany to rebuild itself. The next year, delegates from many countries arrived in Paris to discuss how to prevent a war of such scale from ever occurring again. While attempting to curb any possible resurgences of aggression in Germany, the group were also hoping to restore a sense of order and harmony to the world in the wake of the greatest loss of life their countries had ever seen. The official treaty that marked the ending of the First World War came a little while after the Paris Peace Conference and formed the backbone of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles was drawn up by the victorious Allies and signed by all parties on June 28, 1919, but many historians believe that this well-intentioned treaty actually did more to cause a Second World War rather than prevent it. Signed in Versailles' magnificent Hall of Mirrors, the only country not allowed to take part in the process was Germany. The repercussions and heavy penalties imposed were therefore unworkable and would create a national feeling of resentment and revenge. It was this lack of foresight that eventually would allow the extremist views of Adolf Hitler to not only be listened to, but also acted upon. But Germany weren't the only people feeling that dissatisfied with the outcome. Italy, too, felt that they deserved more for their efforts in the war, and Japan's Empire of the Rising Sun was angered that they didn't receive parts of China in recompense. With hindsight, it is clear to see that this was the beginning of the Axis alliance, as those feeling most left out when it came to the treaty banded together. Matters were made much worse because Germany was also forced to accept sole responsibility for the conflict, pay huge sums of money to the Allied nations for the damage that the war had caused, and relinquish land to specific ethnic groups to form new countries. Part of the deal also required Germany to disband the military, and the manufacture of any armaments was prohibited. For a proud nation with a distinguished tradition of empire building, the treaty added insults to injury. But as the history books tell, an agreement of any kind will only ever hold if all parties involved have something to gain from adhering to it and feel that whether victor or loser, justice has been done. At the end of the First World War, most nations who'd been involved and their citizens developed a pacifist mentality, never wanting to experience the horrors of war again. However, there were those, sadly, who had been inspired by the experience, and two of the most famous of these men were Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. With equally distorted views and a distinct fondness for fascism, they posed a danger to the much longed-for idea of world peace, and neither of them would waste any time rising to power. In 1919, it was generally assumed that all European states would in future be democratic in structure and therefore sufficiently like-minded and peace-loving to make the machinery of the League of Nations work effectively, but this was to prove far more of a dream than a reality. Alongside the soon-to-be fascist dictatorships brewing in Germany and Italy, there was another nation beyond the horizon that had similar conquest-centric ambitions. Japan was a proud militaristic nation, and their leaders had had their eyes on resource-rich China for a long time, though there were certain other nations to take into consideration when musing on the concept of invasion. The Japanese had a history of disputes with America and Russia, and having spent many centuries of its existence with its ports closed to the outside world, it was a nation of great mystery. When the American naval commodore, Admiral Matthew Perry, finally forced the Japanese to open up trading links with the West as the 19th century drew to a close, the Empire of the Rising Sun, without doubt, felt they were being taken advantage of. What's more, with America buying the vast expanses of Alaska from the Russians and winning the Philippine Islands and Guam from the Spanish, Japan was all too aware of the growing dominance of the USA. Hawaii was also annexed, with the Americans creating a naval base there from which they could easily reach their newly acquired territory in the Pacific. As the long-range combat abilities of the 20th century were realized in the latter parts of the First World War, Japan felt increasingly vulnerable to the fast growth of the other great world powers, pushing for the rapid development of their own high-tech navy and air force that would soon match anything found in the factories of the most technologically advanced nations. However, their plans hit a substantial roadblock at the end of the First World War, with the signing of several military reduction treaties. After bitter and bloody fighting in the trenches and great battles at sea when peace eventually prevailed in 1918, treaties were fast put in place to prevent such a war ever breaking out again. But just as the Treaty of Versailles and its draconian measures against the defeated German nation fired Adolf Hitler and other like-minded patriots into action, another treaty caused discontent for the Japanese. The strength of the largest naval powers in the world came under close scrutiny in the aftermath of World War I, and the Washington Naval Treaty was signed between America, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, agreeing limits for each signatory's navy. However, the Japanese felt they had been unfairly constrained by the Americans, and it was the start of a period of conflict between the two culturally diverse nations. The signing of this document would see the Japanese Prime Minister, Prince Fuminari Konoe, state that due to his nation being resource poor, that they would have no resort but to destroy the status quo for the sake of self-preservation. Within a decade, the fragile foundations of peace that the Treaty of Versailles had attempted to construct were under threat, and Konoe's predictions were to become reality. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the world spiraling into an economic depression, and Japan was forced to look further afield for supplies of raw materials to feed the country's dying economy. Over the next 8 years, the rest of the world watched as Japan invaded massive parts of China, specifically Manchuria. The attack and subsequent occupation of the country would eventually see Japan leaving the League of Nations on poor terms with its one-time allies. It was at this stage in the closing days of 1937 that the first real confrontation between America and Japan would set them up for the conflicts to come. While the Japanese were conducting their invasion of the Chinese capital Nanjing, an American gunboat, the USS Panay, attempted to evacuate military and civilian personnel. It was promptly attacked and sunk by the invading Rising Sun forces. This open demonstration of hostility gave the American president every reason to go to war, but with national sentiments still behind their isolationist principles, he declined to intervene fully. Meanwhile, many Japanese expressed remorse at the incident, one of whom wielded considerable government influence. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto made a formal apology to the United States for the Panay incident. He was a Harvard man who'd spent time as a naval attaché in America and was well aware of the considerable naval power that America wielded. He was also more aware than anyone else of the dangers of going to war with a nation as powerful as the United States. To the relief of the Japanese government on Christmas Eve 1937, the president accepted the apology from Tokyo, but while the war continued in China, Roosevelt was increasingly disturbed by the tales of atrocities filtering back to the West. The Japanese military had little respect for human life, and their use of biological weapons and terror bombing was killing millions of civilians throughout China. After the Japanese firebombed Chongqing in May 1939, killing 5,000 people in 2 days, America made decisive moves towards preventing further Japanese brutality. Nevertheless, the battle between China and Japan was prolonged and brutal, and by 1940 still showed no sign of coming to a close. By now, the Japanese had seized territory on the south coast of China, cutting the provisional capital Chongqing off from the sea, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for aid to get through. Only a few tenuous supply routes were left, and Tokyo's generals were eager that they be cut off as soon as possible, so that the battle for southern China could be swiftly won. One of these routes was the Burma Road, which ran from Lashio in the north of British-controlled Burma to the Chinese city of Kunming, and Japan demanded that Churchill have it closed with immediate effect. Britain was in a difficult and vulnerable position as some of its most valuable colonies, including Hong Kong and Singapore, were in the Far East, and with the Battle of Britain in full swing, couldn't afford to spare precious ships for their defence. Japan certainly seemed to have the upper hand, already having taken advantage of the Germans' victory in France by putting pressure on French Indochina to close their routes into China, and it appeared that the British were now equally helpless to protect their interests. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had a grave decision to make, and for the time being at least, he had no other options open, forcing him to reluctantly agree to Japanese demands. On July 17th, the Burma Road was temporarily closed amid cries of shame from the politicians in the House of Commons, and while these events were taking place in Africa, yet another belligerent was making his presence felt. Elsewhere in the world, the threat of fascism and tyranny was spreading at an alarming rate. By September 13th, Mussolini had revived his invasion plans in North Africa and ordered the Italian 10th Army to advance on Egypt. Within 2 weeks, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese had invaded French Indochina and were ready to agree a formal alliance with Nazi Germany. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, then commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, was particularly concerned about the Italian naval presence in the Mediterranean and planned an attack which would eventually become known as Operation Judgment. Although the offensive had been postponed when Neville Chamberlain, then Prime Minister, appeared to have averted war with Germany, by 1940 preparations for the Toronto attack were once more underway. And by the autumn of 1940, when General Graziani brought his troops to a halt at Sidi Barrani and British ships were freed up for action, the Allies seized the opportunity to strike. As Hitler moved inexorably towards a showdown with his nemesis, the Soviet Union, and 1940 drew to a close, on the 29th of December, President Roosevelt delivered one of his famous fireside chats to the American public. The speech marked a definite decline in the isolationist policy of the United States, and it seemed that American intervention was approaching ever closer. While more nations had been drawn to the side of the Axis, Roosevelt warned the Americans of the risks that the Tripartite Pact posed, describing it as an unholy alliance of power to dominate and to enslave the human race. Japan at this time was in the midst of a long and brutal war with China and had already used the weakened position of the Western empires to their advantage. In 1940, Tokyo officials pressured French Indochina to close some of the few routes left which were being used to transport valuable aid into China. Adolf Hitler realized that America's days for neutrality were coming to an end, although the United States had not yet made a declaration of war. Nevertheless, Hitler now had powerful allies, and his treaty with the Japanese would prove to be of great use. Spies from the country were already surveying the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, and by the end of 1941, as relations deteriorated between Washington and Tokyo, the Japanese would launch a devastating attack, not only Pearl Harbor, but American bases around the Pacific, crippling their fleet for a time. Attacking the Soviets proved to be a huge error on the part of the German Führer, who had vastly underestimated the strength of his enemy. What's more, any hopes he had of his Japanese allies attacking Russia from the east as the Nazis advanced from the west were soon dashed, as the Empire of the Rising Sun became rather more preoccupied with their ongoing war with China and awakening a sleeping giant of their own, namely the United States of America. On the 2nd of June 1941, an imperial conference was held in Japan as Hitler's most powerful ally evaluated their position. With Operation Barbarossa putting Russia and Germany at war, the Japanese were reluctant to be drawn into the conflict, as they had issues of their own that demanded more immediate attention. Since they'd been at war since 1937, Japan was substantially committed in Southeast Asia, which could have proved a useful springboard for attacking further north into Russian territory. As time went on, though, it became clear that the ambitions of the Japanese leaders lay with their long-term enemies, the Americans. With the growing tension between their leaders and soldiers, it wouldn't be long before even these isolationist nations were drawn into the conflict that would consume the world over a long 6-year period. While the US had been pushed by the eastern arm of the Axis alliance, it would take one large-scale assault before the American populace and their politicians decided it was time to take action, a lightning strike against the Hawaiian Navy base off Pearl Harbor.